The Pennsylvania highway stretched endlessly through the storm when Ryan Fletcher's headlights caught something wrong. A black Mercedes, elegant as a funeral dress, lay crumpled against the guardrail like a broken bird. Snow swirled through the shattered windshield. Steam rose from the hood in ghostly spirals. Ryan's boots crunched through the drifts as he approached the wreckage. Inside Bumpy, a woman with honey gold hair sat motionless, her tailored suit now a canvas of torn silk and crimson. Both arms hung at angles that made his stomach turn. When her eyes opened, they were the color of winter sky. Beautiful. Terrified. "Please," she whispered, voice barely audible above the wind. "Don't call the police." The platinum watch on her wrist caught the light, worth more than everything he owned. Ryan's phone trembled in his gloved hand, the emergency number half-dialed. The woman's breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps, each exhale a small cloud in the frigid air. Blood had dried in dark streaks down her porcelain cheek, and her lips carried the faintest shade of hypothermia blue. "Ma'am, you're seriously injured," he said, his voice cutting through the wind's howl. "I'm a factory worker, not a doctor." "You need real help." She shook her head with frantic intensity, wincing as the movement sent pain shooting through her broken arms. "No hospitals. No police reports. Please, I'm begging you." Her voice cracked on the last word, raw with something deeper than physical pain. The wind carried the acrid scent of gasoline mixed with expensive perfume. And something else Ryan recognized from his worst days after Sarah's death. Fear. Pure, crystalline terror that had nothing to do with physical injury. He looked back at his battered Ford pickup, its rusted bumper and duct-taped mirrors, then at this broken stranger whose world had shattered as completely as her windshield. The contrast should have been jarring, but something in her eyes spoke a language he understood. Desperation finding its match in unexpected kindness. "What's your name?" he asked gently, crouching beside the wreckage despite the glass crunching under his knees. "Alex," she whispered, as if offering her most precious possession. "Alex Smith." The name sat heavy in the air between them, obviously false, but delivered with such desperate sincerity that Ryan pretended not to notice. Everyone deserved their secrets, especially when they were bleeding in a ditch. He reached through the broken window, careful not to jostle her injuries, and checked her pulse with work-roughened fingers. Racing, but strong. Her skin felt like ice wrapped in silk. "Well, Alex Smith," he said, making a decision that would change everything. "I can't leave you here to freeze to death. My house is 10 minutes away. We'll figure out the rest from there." 25 minutes later, Ryan carried Alex through his front door like she was made of spun glass and good intentions. His modest rental house seemed to shrink around her expensive presence, every piece of second-hand furniture suddenly looking more threadbare in comparison to her tailored elegance. The leather of her Italian shoes alone probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget. Chloe appeared in the hallway, 7 years old and wide-eyed behind wire-rimmed glasses that were held together with medical tape. She clutched a stuffed rabbit that had seen better years, its fur matted from countless nights of comfort. "Daddy, is the pretty lady hurt bad?" she asked, her small voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silence. Alex's breath caught audibly at the word pretty. When was the last time someone had called her that without wanting stock tips or merger information in return? When had a child last looked at her with simple concern instead of practiced politeness? Chloe stepped closer, completely unafraid, possessing that fearless honesty that adults spent lifetimes trying to recapture. She looked sad, the little girl observed with devastating accuracy. Like when you cry in the bathroom after you think I'm asleep. Ryan's jaw tightened at his daughter's unwitting revelation, but Alex felt something crack open inside her chest. A fissure in walls she'd spent decades building. She needs our help tonight, sweetheart, Ryan explained, settling Alex onto their worn sectional couch with infinite care. The contrast was stark and somehow beautiful. Her designer suit against faded denim upholstery, her manicured nails against rough fabric that had survived years of movie nights and homework sessions. Yet somehow, impossibly, she looked more at peace than she had in the twisted metal of her Mercedes. Chloe disappeared with the serious efficiency of a child on a mission and returned with her most prized possession. A patchwork quilt her grandmother had sewn by hand, each square telling a story of family love and patient dedication. Here, she offered solemnly, tucking it around Alex's shoulders with the reverence of bestowing knighthood. This always makes me feel better when the world gets too scary. Alex's composure crumbled at the simple gesture. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years began to fall, each drop carrying the weight of isolation she'd never learned how to share. The quilt smelled like fabric softener and children's shampoo and something indefinable that could only be called home. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. Chloe beamed with pride, then settled cross-legged on the floor beside the couch like a tiny guardian. "Do you want me to read you a story?" she asked seriously. "Stories always help when I'm scared." "I know all the best ones." Alex nodded, not trusting her voice, and listened as this small angel began reciting The Velveteen Rabbit. From memory, her words weaving a spell of comfort Alex hadn't felt since childhood. The next morning brought crystalline sunlight that turned the snow-covered world into a postcard of perfection. Dr. Hayes arrived with his weathered medical bag and the unhurried manner of someone who had delivered 3 generations of babies and seen every injury small-town life could offer. His examination was thorough but gentle, accompanied by quiet humming and the occasional mm-hmm of professional assessment. "Clean breaks in both forearms," he announced, wrapping Alex's arms in temporary splints with practiced efficiency. "You'll need surgery eventually, proper pins and plates, but this will stabilize things for now. Lucky you didn't lose consciousness for long. Head injuries in weather like that." He shook his grey head meaningfully. Alex nodded, carefully avoiding Ryan's searching gaze. She could feel his curiosity like heat radiating from a fire, warming and dangerous in equal measure. "The concussion is mild," Dr. Hayes continued, packing his instruments with the systematic precision of decades of practice. "But you'll need monitoring for the next week or 2. No driving, obviously. No stress, no sudden movements, no activities that might jar those bones." He fixed her with a stern look over his reading glasses. "Rest is the only medicine that matters now, young lady. Your body's been through trauma. Give it time to heal." His eyes flickered meaningfully to Ryan. Lucky she's got good people looking after her. The words carried an undercurrent of small-town discretion. No questions about insurance cards or identification required. As the doctor's ancient Buick disappeared down the snow-lined lane, kicking up small clouds of powder in its wake, Alex found herself alone with strangers who had somehow become her lifeline overnight. Ryan moved through his compact kitchen with quiet competence, preparing breakfast one-handed while Chloe provided running commentary on everything from the proper egg-to-milk ratio for scrambled eggs to the tragic story of her loose tooth. The domestic symphony felt foreign, yet deeply comforting. like remembering a lullaby from childhood. "I should pay you," Alex offered quietly, her voice barely audible over the sizzle of butter in the pan. "For the inconvenience, the medical bills, letting me stay here." Her words carried the automatic assumption that money could solve any social awkwardness. Ryan paused in his egg scrambling, his broad shoulders tensing beneath his flannel shirt. Steam rose from the pan like incense, carrying the scent of simple comfort. "This isn't about money," he said without turning around, his voice carrying a weight she couldn't quite decipher. Pride, maybe. Or something deeper, more fundamental about the kind of man who stopped for strangers in blizzards. "Though I appreciate the offer." The words were polite but firm, establishing boundaries she hadn't expected. Chloe looked up from her coloring book with the solemn expression of a child translating adult subtext. "Daddy doesn't like when people think helping costs money," she explained matter-of-factly. "He says kindness is free, or it's not really kindness." The 7-year-old's wisdom hit Alex like a physical blow, revealing truths about human nature she'd forgotten in boardrooms and merger negotiations. Over the following days, Chloe became Alex's unwitting confessor and most persistent interviewer. 7-year-olds possessed a supernatural ability to ask questions that adults wouldn't dare voice, their curiosity unfiltered by social convention or professional courtesy. "Why don't you have any kids?" she inquired, while meticulously coloring a unicorn purple and gold, her tongue poking out in concentration. Alex's pen froze over the crossword puzzle she'd been attempting one-handed, the simple question hitting like a surgical strike to her most carefully guarded vulnerabilities. "I work too much," she admitted, the truth slipping out before her corporate training could catch it and spin it into acceptable deflection. The words hung in the kitchen air like smoke, dissipating slowly, but leaving their mark on everything they touched. Chloe nodded with the sage wisdom that children sometimes possessed, as if Alex had confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Daddy works a lot too," she said, switching to a silver crayon for the unicorn's horn. "2 jobs, sometimes 3 when money gets scary. But he always makes me pancakes on Sunday." She looked up with eyes that were her father's exact shade of brown, warm and honest, and devastating in their simplicity. "Even when he's super tired and his back hurts from the factory." He says pancakes are like hugs you can eat. The casual revelation hit Alex like a tsunami of recognition. When was the last time someone had made her pancakes? When was the last time she'd had a Sunday that wasn't consumed by quarterly reports, board meetings, and the endless hunger of corporate ambition? The lies began small and necessary, as lies often do when truth feels too dangerous to handle. When Ryan asked about her work during dinner preparation, Alex mentioned office administration in vague terms, letting him fill in the blanks with assumptions about filing and phone answering. When he wondered about family with the careful delicacy of someone who understood loss, she spoke even more vaguely about being between situations and figuring things out. Each deception felt protective rather than malicious, like layers of bubble wrap around something too fragile to expose. How could she explain that she commanded a corporate empire from the 52nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper? That her decisions affected thousands of employees across 6 continents? That her last actual vacation had been a business retreat in Switzerland 3 years ago, and even then she'd spent most of it on conference calls? But secrets have weight, accumulating mass like snowflakes until they threaten to bury everything beneath them. Alex found herself editing her vocabulary in real time, swallowing references to stock options and merger negotiations mid-sentence. When Chloe asked about her favorite restaurant with the innocent expectation of hearing about McDonald's or the local diner, Alex almost mentioned Le Bernardin, where she took potential investors for $100 lunches that were more negotiation than nutrition. "I like home cooking," she said instead, surprised by the sincerity that emerged with the deflection. Ryan's smile at her answer warmed something deep in her chest that had been frozen for longer than she cared to calculate. She was discovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of corporate armor, parts that enjoyed washing dishes one-handed while Chloe sang off-key pop songs and Ryan hummed along from the living room. Ryan noticed everything with the quiet attention of someone accustomed to reading people and situations for survival. The way Alex automatically calculated tips to the exact percentage when he mentioned the pizza delivery cost. How she knew current exchange rates when the evening news mentioned foreign markets in passing. Her unconscious use of business jargon before catching herself mid-sentence and translating into civilian terms. He began cataloguing these inconsistencies like a detective building a case, but instead of suspicion, he felt something closer to protectiveness. Whatever secret she was hiding seemed to cause her more pain than it could possibly cause him. The woman helping his daughter with advanced math homework and laughing until she snorted at terrible dad jokes during late-night television wasn't a threat. She was something else entirely, something he hadn't expected to find in his carefully ordered existence of work, bills, and bedtime stories. 3 weeks into her stay, Alex's carefully constructed facade began developing stress fractures that no amount of corporate training could repair. The phone calls came more frequently now, her device buzzing against kitchen counters and nightstand surfaces with increasing urgency. She would glance at the screen, her face tightening with familiar stress patterns Ryan was beginning to recognize, before declining the calls with fingers that trembled despite her best efforts at control. "Telemarketers," she would mutter, but Ryan had worked enough customer service jobs to recognize the look of professional pressure. The way she held her shoulders when the phone rang, the unconscious checking of stock prices on his laptop when she thought he was focused on helping Chloe with homework, the vocabulary that slipped through her defenses like water through cracks in a dam. One particularly quiet evening, while Chloe slept upstairs and snow fell in fat, lazy flakes outside the kitchen window, Alex stood vigil like a sentry keeping watch against invisible enemies. Ryan found her there, silhouetted against the darkness, her healing arms cradled carefully against her chest in an unconscious gesture of self-protection. The moonlight caught the gold in her hair and made her look ethereal, like something from a fairy tale about lost princesses and forgotten kingdoms. "Regrets?" he asked softly, joining her silent observation of the sleeping world beyond their walls. She didn't turn around, but he saw her shoulders tense at the question. "Too many to count?" she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of decisions she could never unmake. "But not this," she added quickly, as if afraid he might misunderstand. "Not being here. Not meeting you and Chloe." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither dared to cross, fragile as spun glass and twice as precious. Ryan wanted to ask more, to understand the sadness that clung to her like expensive perfume, acrid and sharp even when she smiled. Instead, he offered the gift of shared silence, standing beside her in comfortable companionship, while the world outside held its breath in winter stillness. "Sometimes I forget," Alex murmured after several minutes had passed, her words barely audible above the house's settling sounds. "Who I used to be before all this." She gestured vaguely with her good elbow, encompassing the modest kitchen, the simple life, the peace she'd discovered in suburban anonymity. It scares me that I might forget again when I have to go back." The vulnerability in her voice made Ryan's chest ache with protective instincts he thought had died with his wife. The beginning of the end arrived with cruel timing and childish innocence, the way most disasters do. Chloe was eating cereal and half-watching morning cartoons when the programming switched to local news. Tech stocks continue their steep decline as Morrison Industries enters its fourth week without CEO Alexandra Morrison, the anchor announced with the practiced neutrality of someone reading other people's tragedies. Sources close to the company report that the board of directors has been unable to contact Morrison since her unexplained disappearance, leading to widespread speculation about her mental state and the company's future stability. Alex lunged for the remote control with her elbow, but momentum and panic made her clumsy. The remote skittered across the coffee table and fell to the floor, landing just out of reach of her splintered arms. Chloe looked up from her Lucky Charms with mild interest, milk dripping from her spoon. "That lady has the same name as you," she observed with the matter-of-fact tone children used for discussing coincidences. "Except you're Alex Smith, and she's Alex Morrison. That's funny, right?" She turned to look at Alex, who had gone pale as fresh snow, her winter sky eyes wide with the trapped look of an animal caught in headlights. Ryan's coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips, the liquid inside growing cold as understanding crashed over him like an avalanche. The expensive watch, the unconscious business knowledge, the fear of hospitals and police reports, the phone calls she wouldn't answer. Alex Smith wasn't hiding from an abusive husband or running from gambling debts. She was hiding from herself, from a life so big and complicated that she'd tried to disappear into someone else's existence entirely. Ryan waited until Chloe was safely at school, her backpack bouncing as she skipped toward the bus stop with the resilient optimism of childhood, before confronting the truth that had been hiding in his guest room for nearly a month. Alex sat at his kitchen table like a defendant awaiting judgment, her laptop closed, her hands folded carefully in her lap to keep them from trembling. The morning light streaming through his windows seemed to expose everything, stripping away the comfortable illusions they'd both been maintaining. "Alexandra Morrison," he said quietly, not making it a question because questions implied doubt, and he had none left. She nodded once, sharp and definitive, the gesture somehow both confirmation and surrender. "You're the CEO of Morrison Industries." Another nod, this one smaller, as if she could make herself disappear through sheer force of will. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with the weight of 26 days' worth of carefully constructed deceptions. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked at something only it could see, and the sound seemed to come from another world entirely. "The woman on the news," Ryan continued, his voice carefully modulated to hide the storm building in his chest. "Worth $2.8 billion, according to Forbes. Missing for 26 days, causing market panic and widespread speculation." He paused, studying her face for signs of the person he thought he'd known. "That's you." It wasn't a question either, but Alex treated it like one anyway, her composure finally cracking like ice under pressure. Tears she'd been holding back for weeks began to fall, each drop carrying the weight of isolation she'd never learned how to share. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice breaking like spring ice on a pond. "The accident, staying here, lying to you and Chloe." Each word seemed to cost her something essential, as if truth-telling was a skill she'd forgotten how to practice. Ryan sat across from her, his calloused hands flat on the table between them, close enough to touch but separated by an ocean of complicated reality. What did you mean to happen? He asked, genuine curiosity replacing anger in his voice. The question seemed to surprise her, as if no one had asked about her intentions rather than her actions in longer than she could remember. Alex looked up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the news report had shattered their comfortable fiction. I meant to drive until I couldn't anymore, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of complete honesty. Until the pressure stopped crushing my chest every morning. Until I could sleep without dreaming about quarterly reports and hostile takeovers. Until I could breathe again without feeling like I was suffocating on my own success. Her laugh was bitter and hollow, the sound of someone who had forgotten how joy was supposed to feel. I built an empire that everyone said was supposed to make me happy, and instead it became a prison so beautiful and gilded that I forgot I was trapped inside it. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, dissipating slowly but leaving its mark on everything it touched. These 3 weeks, she continued, looking around his modest kitchen as if memorizing every detail. I felt more human than I have in 7 years. I remembered what it's like to matter to someone for reasons that have nothing to do with stock prices or market share. Ryan absorbed this revelation like a man learning he'd been harboring not a fugitive from justice, but someone running from a life that had grown too large for her to inhabit. 26 days, he repeated slowly, the number taking on new weight as he considered its implications. Your company, your employees, your responsibilities. Alex's shoulders sagged under the invisible weight she'd been carrying since she was 25 years old and inherited more money than most people could spend in several lifetimes. 50,000 people depend on me, she said, the words heavy with guilt and exhaustion. 50,000 families who need their jobs, their health insurance, their sense of security. And I walked away because I couldn't handle being responsible for all of their lives anymore. She paused, studying her hands as if they belonged to someone else. But these 3 weeks with you and Chloe, she continued, I felt more alive than I have since I took over the company. I remembered what it's like to be loved for who you are, instead of what you can provide. The moment of reckoning shattered like a dropped mirror when car doors began slamming outside with the precision of a military operation. Black sedans lined Ryan's quiet street like a funeral procession, their tinted windows reflecting nothing but cold efficiency. Men and women in expensive suits emerged from the vehicles, their breath visible in the cold air, their expressions uniformly serious and professionally concerned. Ryan's neighbors would be talking about this spectacle for months, peering through curtains and speculating about what kind of trouble had found their quiet subdivision. Alex closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if drawing strength from sources Ryan couldn't see. They found me, she said simply, the words carrying resignation and relief in equal measure. The cavalry had arrived, whether she wanted rescue or not. The doorbell rang once, sharp and insistent as a summons. Then again, with the persistence of people accustomed to having their calls answered immediately. Alexandra Morrison, a voice called through the wood, cultured and commanding, even muffled by Ryan's front door. We need to talk. The board is waiting. Ryan moved to the window, watching the small army of corporate executives arrange themselves on his modest front porch like pieces on a chessboard. Their shoes alone probably cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. Who are they? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer from watching enough news reports about corporate America. My board of directors, Alex replied, standing slowly as if her bones had aged decades in the past few minutes. My life. The words carried a finality that made Ryan's chest tighten, with something he couldn't quite name. Loss, perhaps, or the recognition that fairy tales didn't survive contact with quarterly earnings reports. The man at Ryan's door introduced himself with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the winter weather, his handshake firm enough to crush walnuts, his smile practiced enough to sell bridges to trolls. "Chief Operating Officer," he explained to Ryan, as if titles were currency in whatever world these people inhabited. Behind him stood 5 other executives, their collective presence filling Ryan's small living room like water filling a sinking ship. Every piece of furniture suddenly looked shabby and insufficient, every family photo a reminder of how different their worlds really were. "Miss Morrison," the COO said formally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never had to question whether his words would be obeyed. "Morrison Industries has been operating in crisis mode for nearly a month. Stock prices have dropped 40%, wiping out billions in shareholder value. Investors are threatening mass withdrawal, and our competitors are circling like vultures, sensing weakness." Alex stood in the doorway between kitchen and living room, caught between 2 worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile without destroying one or both. Her broken arms were still in splints, but she carried herself with unconscious authority that hadn't been there when Ryan first pulled her from the wreckage. CEO Alexandra Morrison was reasserting herself like a dormant volcano returning to life, and Ryan could see the transformation happening in real time. The vulnerable woman who had cried at a child's kindness was disappearing, replaced by someone who commanded boardrooms and managed billion-dollar acquisitions with the casual efficiency of ordering coffee. "I'm aware of the financial impact," she said, her voice steady now, professional in a way that made Ryan feel like a stranger in his own home. "But I'm not ready to return to the office. I'm still recovering from serious injuries." The words were true, but felt like deflection, corporate speak designed to buy time rather than reveal truth. The executives exchanged glances heavy with meaning and unspoken communication, the kind of wordless coordination that came from years of managing crises and containing damage. "Ready or not," the COO replied with smooth ruthlessness. "The company needs its leader. We have medical leave proposals prepared, public relations statements drafted, and a transition plan that can be implemented immediately." He opened a leather portfolio that probably cost more than Ryan's car and withdrew documents that looked official enough to reshape reality. "But first, you need to stabilize the immediate situation. The market opens in 3 hours, and another day of uncertainty could trigger a complete collapse." Ryan watched this corporate theater unfold in his living room, feeling increasingly like an outsider in his own home. These people spoke a language he didn't understand, operated by rules he'd never learned, moved through the world with a confidence that came from never having to worry about mortgage payments or grocery budgets. The moment stretched like a rubber band approaching its breaking point when Chloe burst through the front door with the unstoppable energy of childhood, her backpack dragging behind her, her cheeks red from the cold walk home from school. She stopped short at the sight of strangers in expensive suits occupying her living room, their presence somehow making the familiar space feel foreign and unwelcoming. "Who are all these people?" she asked, looking to her father for explanation and protection with the absolute trust that children reserved for their heroes. Her voice carried a note of worry that made Alex's heart clench with protective instincts she didn't know she possessed. "Daddy, why do they look so serious? Are we in trouble?" The innocence of the questions made the corporate machinations seem suddenly absurd, like watching adults play dress-up in a child's playroom. Alex knelt down to Chloe's eye level with careful attention to her healing arms, her expensive armor cracking again as maternal instincts overrode professional obligations. "These are people from my work, sweetheart," she explained gently, her voice soft with affection that had nothing to do with quarterly profits or market share. "They need me to come back and help them with some important business." The words felt like betrayal even as she spoke them, reducing weeks of genuine connection to a temporary inconvenience that could be managed with proper scheduling. Chloe's lower lip began to tremble with the devastating honesty of a child who didn't understand why adults made everything so complicated. "But you live here now," she protested, her voice rising with panic. "You help me with math homework and make funny voices when you read stories. You teach me how to braid hair, and you know all the words to my favorite songs." The innocence of Chloe's logic made the corporate emergency seem suddenly manageable and utterly impossible at the same time. "That's just it, baby girl," Alex said, her voice thick with emotions she couldn't afford to feel in front of board members and shareholders. "I don't really live here. I've been visiting while I got better." The distinction was lost on Chloe, but hit Ryan with devastating clarity that felt like physical impact. Visiting implied temporary arrangements and predetermined endings. Visiting meant leaving was always the plan, no matter how comfortable the present moment felt. "When?" Ryan asked, the word emerging rougher than he'd intended, carrying weight that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with the sudden realization that his life was about to return to its previous dimensions. Alex looked at him over Chloe's head, her eyes reflecting a pain that had nothing to do with broken bones and everything to do with broken hearts that couldn't be splintered back together. "Tonight," the COO answered for her, with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected other people's lives. "We have a private jet waiting at the regional airport. The emergency board meeting has been scheduled for tomorrow morning, and we need time to prepare Ms. Morrison for the questions she'll face." He checked his expensive watch with the casual precision of someone who measured time in market fluctuations rather than heartbeats. "The longer we delay, the more damage control will be required." Alex nodded slowly, accepting her fate with the resignation of someone who had forgotten how to fight for personal happiness when professional obligations called. "I need to pack," she said simply, the words carrying finality that made the modest living room feel like a courtroom where sentences were being pronounced. "It won't take long. I don't have much here." The last sentence hit Ryan like a physical blow, reducing weeks of shared meals and bedtime stories to the contents of a single suitcase. But Chloe wasn't finished fighting, possessing the brutal honesty that could cut through corporate doublespeak like scissors through tissue paper. 7-year-olds didn't understand market forces or fiduciary responsibilities or the weight of shareholder expectations. They understood love and loyalty and the difference between people who stayed and people who left. "Don't you want to stay with us?" she asked Alex directly, her small voice cutting through the adult conversation like a sword through silk. "Don't you love us enough to pick us instead of work?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that no amount of business school training had prepared anyone to answer. The executives shuffled uncomfortably, their expensive shoes suddenly seeming inadequate for the emotional terrain they'd stumbled into. This wasn't part of their strategic retrieval plan, and none of them had experience managing the intersection of corporate necessity and human heartbreak. Alex's composure finally shattered completely, like glass under pressure she could no longer contain. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying more truth than any annual report she'd ever signed. "I do love you. Both of you. More than I thought it was possible to love anyone." The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it devastated her, as if she had discovered something about herself that had been hiding behind years of professional achievement and personal isolation. She looked at Ryan with eyes that pleaded for understanding she wasn't sure she deserved. "But love doesn't always get to win," she continued, the words carrying the bitter wisdom of someone who had learned to prioritize obligation over happiness. "Sometimes there are things bigger than what we want, responsibilities that don't care about our feelings." The admission broke something fundamental in Ryan's chest, a recognition that the fairy tale he'd been living was about to return to the harsh reality of mortgage payments and single parenthood. That evening, as Alex prepared to leave for a life she'd tried to escape, she moved through Ryan's house like someone memorizing a museum before closing time. Her fingers traced the back of the couch where she'd spent 3 weeks recovering from more than just broken bones. She stood for a long moment in front of the refrigerator, studying Chloe's artwork and school papers with the attention of someone trying to preserve memories against future forgetting. In the guest room that had become temporarily hers, she folded clothes with her one functional hand, her movements mechanical and efficient in the way that people packed when leaving was survival rather than choice. "There's something I need to tell you," she said when Ryan appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the small space with warmth she was about to leave behind forever. Her voice carried the weight of confession that had been building for weeks. Ryan leaned against the door frame, giving her space while offering his attention with the patience that had first made her trust him with her secrets. "My real name isn't Alexandra Morrison," she continued, her words coming faster now, as if speed could make the truth easier to bear. "I mean, it is legally, but for the past 3 weeks, in my head, I've been Alexandra Morrison Fletcher." She looked up from her packing, her eyes bright with tears that had nothing to do with professional obligations and everything to do with personal loss. "I added your name 3 days after I got here, when Chloe called me Mama Alex for the first time. Stupid, right?" The confession hung between them like a bridge neither had asked for, but both desperately wanted to cross. Like I was playing house with people who had real lives and real problems, while I hid from my responsibilities. Ryan stepped into the room, his presence making the modest space feel smaller and more intimate. "Not stupid," he said quietly, his voice carrying certainties she hadn't expected. "Hopeful." The word seemed to surprise them both with its weight and possibility. Alex looked up from her mechanical packing, her hand stilling over clothes that suddenly seemed less important than the man standing in her temporary doorway. "I've spent 7 years building something that everyone said was supposed to matter," she said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been running a race without understanding why winning was important. "Stock prices and market share and quarterly growth that looks impressive in annual reports. But the only thing that's ever truly mattered to me is what I found in this house." She gestured around the modest room with its simple furniture and family photographs. Peace that didn't require conquest. Love that didn't come with performance metrics. Her voice cracked on the last words, revealing vulnerabilities that board meetings and shareholder presentations had never allowed her to express. "You and Chloe taught me what I was actually hungry for all these years. Someone who loved me for making pancakes instead of making millions. A little girl who wanted bedtime stories more than she wanted expensive presents. A man who valued kindness over net worth." She attempted a laugh that came out more like a sob, the sound of someone discovering treasure at the exact moment they had to give it away. "And now I have to go back to the world where none of that exists, where love is a liability and family is something you schedule between conference calls." Ryan wanted to tell her she could choose differently, that she could stay and build something new with them. But they both understood that 50,000 jobs carried weight that personal happiness couldn't balance. The goodbye unfolded with surgical precision, like removing a bandage from a wound that hadn't finished healing. Alex knelt beside Chloe's bed, smoothing back the child's hair with her good hand while trying to memorize the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. "Will you visit?" Chloe asked sleepily, her small hand clutching Alex's finger with the desperate strength of someone sensing abandonment. "Will you call me and tell me about your important work? Will you remember that I love you even when you're far away?" Each question hit Alex like a physical blow, promises she wanted to make but wasn't sure she could keep. The corporate world had a way of consuming everything in its path, including the best intentions and the deepest loves. "I'll try, sweetheart," Alex whispered, the words carrying more hope than certainty. "I'll try to remember everything you taught me about what really matters." She kissed Chloe's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood that would haunt her through every board meeting and shareholder presentation for months to come. "You be good for your daddy, okay? Keep making him smile the way you made me smile." Ryan stood in the doorway, watching this intimate farewell with the helpless feeling of someone witnessing a tragedy they were powerless to prevent. His daughter was losing the closest thing to a mother she'd had since Sarah died, and he was losing something he hadn't even known he'd been searching for until it was walking away. The walk to the waiting car felt like a funeral procession, Ryan's boots crunching on snow that seemed too ordinary for such an extraordinary ending. The corporate sedan waited with its engine running, exhaust rising in ghostly clouds that seemed to echo the steam from her wrecked Mercedes weeks earlier. "Thank you," Alex said simply when they reached the vehicle, her words carrying the weight of gratitude that encompassed more than rescue from a car accident. "For saving me, for showing me what I was missing, for letting me pretend to be part of a real family for a little while." The words hung in the cold air between them, visible as small clouds that dissipated quickly, but left their impact on the silence that followed. Ryan nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to respond with words that could encompass everything she'd given them in return. The car door closed with the expensive finality of a coffin lid, sealing Alex away from the life she'd discovered and back into the existence she'd been born to inhabit. Through the tinted windows, her silhouette grew smaller as the sedan pulled away, carrying her back to a world of glass towers and profit margins where love was a luxury few could afford. Ryan stood in his driveway until the taillights disappeared around the corner, taking with them the woman who had taught his daughter to braid hair and him to believe in second chances. The snow continued to fall, covering the tire tracks and erasing the physical evidence of what had been the most meaningful month of his adult life. Inside the house, Chloe's muffled crying drifted down from her bedroom, the sound of a child learning that sometimes people leave not because they want to, but because the world demands sacrifices that love alone cannot prevent. 6 months later, Morrison Industries made headlines again, but this time the news carried hope instead of crisis. Tech giant adopts revolutionary remote leadership model, the business journals proclaimed, with the enthusiasm of reporters covering genuine innovation instead of corporate disaster. CEO Alexandra Morrison pioneers work-life balance in corporate America while achieving record profits. The articles detailed productivity increases, improved employee satisfaction scores, and stock prices that had not only recovered, but reached historic heights that made early investors wealthy beyond their wildest projections. What the financial press didn't mention was the small house in Pennsylvania where the CEO spent her evenings, or the 7-year-old girl who still called her Alex instead of Miss Morrison during their nightly video calls. They didn't write about the man who had learned that love could indeed win, just not in the dramatic ways that movies suggested, but in the quiet persistence of people who refused to let distance define the boundaries of family. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy, requiring months of careful negotiation with board members who couldn't understand why geographical proximity mattered less than digital connectivity in an increasingly virtual world. Alex had fought battles in conference rooms and shareholder meetings, using the same strategic thinking that had built her empire to dismantle the assumptions about how that empire had to be managed. She'd proven that a CEO could lead from anywhere, as long as she understood where home was located. The victory had been expensive, requiring compromises and concessions that would have seemed impossible before she'd learned the difference between being successful and being fulfilled. But every sacrifice felt manageable when measured against the alternative of returning to the gilded isolation she'd mistaken for achievement. The wedding took place on a spring afternoon when Pennsylvania had finally shaken off winter's grip, and the world seemed drunk on possibilities. Ryan's backyard had been transformed with white chairs borrowed from the church and flowers picked from neighbors' gardens, creating an intimate cathedral under an April sky that seemed painted specifically for their ceremony. Chloe served as both flower girl and ring bearer, her gap-toothed grin wider than the horizon as she processed down an aisle made of grass and good intentions. She wore a yellow dress that Alex had helped her pick out during one of their weekend shopping expeditions, and flowers in her hair that she'd insisted on arranging herself because princesses always do their own hair for important parties. The sight of her walking carefully between the chairs, scattering rose petals with the serious concentration of someone entrusted with sacred duties, made every adult present remember why love mattered more than any quarterly earnings report. Dr. Hayes officiated with the quiet authority of someone who had watched this love story unfold from its broken beginning, his weathered hands steady as he guided them through vows that had taken months to write and lifetimes to understand. Alex wore a simple white dress instead of a designer suit, her arms finally healed, her hands steady as she spoke promises she had crafted herself in the early morning hours when the corporate world was sleeping. "You taught me that wealth isn't measured in stock options or market capitalization," she told Ryan, her voice carrying across the small gathering with the confidence of someone who had learned to speak truth instead of corporate messaging. "It's measured in Sunday morning pancakes and bedtime stories read in funny voices and someone who loves you enough to save you from yourself when you've forgotten how to find your way home." The words floated over their assembled friends and family like benediction, settling into hearts that had witnessed the miracle of two broken people teaching each other how to heal. Ryan's vows were characteristically simpler, delivered in the straightforward manner that had first attracted her to his fundamental decency. "You came into our lives broken and somehow fixed everything we didn't know was missing," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. "You taught Chloe that smart women can build empires and still make time for homework help. You taught me that fairy tales aren't just stories people tell children, but possibilities that adults can create when they're brave enough to choose love over fear." Behind them, Morrison Industries' stock ticker ran silently across a tablet screen that someone had propped against a fence post, the numbers climbing steadily upward in real-time proof that a CEO could lead from anywhere as long as she knew where her heart lived. The irony wasn't lost on the assembled guests that the most successful merger of Alex's career had nothing to do with corporate acquisitions and everything to do with learning how to combine two lives into something stronger than either could be alone. The reception continued into the evening, with music provided by Ryan's ancient stereo system and dancing on grass that had been mowed specifically for the occasion. Neighbors who had initially been suspicious of the corporate invasion had been won over by months of Alex's genuine participation in community life, her attendance at school plays and bake sales, proving that money didn't automatically disqualify someone from understanding what mattered to real people. She had learned to navigate the delicate social ecosystem of suburban parenthood, earning acceptance not through charitable donations or executive privilege, but through the simple act of showing up consistently for people who had never appeared on any board of directors, but whose approval meant more than any shareholder vote. As the evening wound down and guests began collecting children and car keys, Alex found herself in the kitchen washing dishes alongside women who had become friends rather than networking opportunities. The conversation flowed easily between updates about teenagers' college applications and concerns about aging parents, topics that would have seemed impossibly foreign to her just 2 years earlier, but now felt as natural as breathing. "You know what I love most about this?" asked Janet from 3 houses down, drying a casserole dish with the easy familiarity of someone who had attended dozens of similar celebrations. "You could have hired caterers and event planners and made this some fancy affair, but instead you chose to make it feel like family." The observation hit Alex with the recognition that this was exactly what she had been searching for without knowing it had a name. The sense of belonging that no amount of corporate success had ever provided. The final scene played out in the same kitchen where Alex had once hidden her identity and learned to make pancakes one-handed, her laptop permanently closed after business hours, her priorities clear in ways that would have seemed impossible during her previous life as an always-available corporate leader. 2 years later, she stood at the same counter watching Ryan teach their newest family member how to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl. Baby Samuel barely walking, but determined to help with breakfast preparation despite his obvious lack of motor skills. "Daddy's not very good at this," Chloe observed with 9-year-old wisdom, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had appointed herself family cooking instructor. "That's why we need Mama Alex to supervise." And the title still made Alex's heart skip with joy that had nothing to do with profit margins or market share, everything to do with a love that measured success in sticky hugs and bedtime stories rather than quarterly growth percentages. Outside, Pennsylvania snow began to fall again in fat, lazy flakes that caught the kitchen light and turned the world into something from a Christmas card. But this time, the weather looked like blessing instead of the burial shroud it had seemed that night when Ryan first pulled her from the wreckage. Alex closed her laptop for the day, her work complete, her priorities arranged in order of actual importance rather than corporate urgency. Tomorrow there would be board meetings conducted via video conference and strategic planning sessions managed from her home office. But tonight belonged to pancake preparation and homework assistance, and the delicate art of putting a toddler to bed without waking the neighbors. She had learned to live successfully in both worlds, but only because she had discovered which one provided the foundation for everything else that mattered. The woman who had once driven through a blizzard to escape her life now understood that sometimes you have to break completely before you can heal into something better. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find what you actually needed all along.